Welcome to JLife with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, chaos has erupted on college campuses all throughout the country. And while I'm surprised by the quantity, by the sheer magnitude of what has happened on campus, I can't say I am surprised in general at the general trend that is happening on campuses all throughout the country. And for people that have been paying attention and listening to people that spend time on campus, both in terms of the rise of anti-Israel / anti-Semitic sentiment on campus, and in general, the ceding of ground by academics to activism, both things I will talk about in a few minutes. The writing was all but on the wall for campuses throughout the country. And as we are in for a chaotic end to the academic year, campus administrators can't help but just count the days and try to run out the clock before the end of the academic year, before things erupt to another bad level. More on that a little bit later. But I want to discuss, and this is going to be a relatively brief podcast just to get a lot of my initial thoughts out there. And then, of course, this is going to be a wider sociological and eventually historical trend that we're going to be revisiting on many future podcasts. I want to try to make the wider argument that these campus protests are bad for everyone. It doesn't matter what side of this issue you're on. You can be pro-Israel, you can be pro-Palestinian, you can be a neutral observer. These protests don't help everybody, don't help anybody. And let's actually start with the most counterintuitive group first. The campus protests and the rise of anti-Israelism within the wider Western world hurts the Palestinians right now that are living in Gaza. They hurt the Palestinians that are living in the West Bank. They hurt the 20% of Israeli Arabs / Palestinians that are living as citizens of Israel. And they really hurt Palestinians abroad. And to understand why, we have to take a wider step back and understand that there are two completely different frameworks that are in operation when people talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. From the dominant Israeli view, again, whatever you think about this view, you could think this view is completely correct. You could think this view is completely incorrect. You can be confused and not know. You can have a more moderate view in the middle. The dominant Israeli view sees Zionism as a historic return, right? Note the verb, return. Jews have returned to Israel. Jews see Zionism as a coming home of sorts. And the story goes as follows. 2,000 years ago, Jews were kicked out of our historic homeland, the land of Israel, by the Roman Empire. Jews subsequently spreaded throughout the world, sparking the diaspora. And after 2,000 years, Jews who have spent those 2,000 years praying towards Israel, writing poetry about Israel, praying about returning to Israel, writing songs, incorporating it into our liturgy, right? Next year in Jerusalem at the end of the Passover Seder, Jews finally were granted the opportunity to return. And of course, the mechanism of that return in the late 19th and early 20th century used a lot of the same tools that all other nation states were using in the 19th and 20th century. So sure, you have some quotes, or it looks like early Zionism utilized some of the tools and mechanisms of colonialism. Well, of course they did. That was the way in which nation states were formed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This doesn't mean that it's above criticism. This doesn't mean that it's okay. This is not whataboutism. But again, note that when I'm explaining here, far more descriptive than normatively. In other words, I'm not saying what is right or not, but I'm describing what happened historically. Is Zionism coincided with the rise of colonialism, but Zionism was never motivated by the same mindset and ideology of colonialism, right? There was never any motherland. There was never any attempt to plunder a land and then go back to a homeland, right? That is the bread and butter of colonialism. What's happening right now is that Palestinians, through Western activism, are being convinced that Zionism is colonialism. In other words, they're being convinced to see history and see current politics in the Middle East through a lens of delusion. Now, I genuinely feel bad for the Palestinians. I want to take a step back because historically, I was a more liberal Zionist. I still, in theory, if you ask me, if I had all the power in the world and everybody in the world would listen to me for an hour, and they asked me, okay, what do you do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I would give an extremely impassioned speech about the need for a two-state solution. It seems obvious. You have two people fighting over a land, both, I think, with somewhat reasonable historical claims to the land. Obviously, once we get into the footnotes, it gets more interesting on really both sides once we start to tease out what does it mean to have a right to the land? What is the definition of being indigenous? How did Jews end up coming back to Israel? How did Palestinians end up getting to the land that they now call Palestine, right? There's a lot of really interesting history there. But in general, the idea that both Jews and Palestinians both have a reasonable claim to this piece of land between the river and the sea that we call Israel and they call Palestine, I agree with that. And so just like any other situation where two people both have claims, right? There's a famous debate in the Talmud of what happens if I run into a courtroom with somebody else and we're both holding half of a sweater or a talit, and we say, this is mine, and the other person says, this is theirs. The judge, if the judge hears both of our claims and thinks we both have reasonable pretense to thinking the entire thing is ours, splits it in half and says, sell it and split the money. So, okay, I am pro a two-state solution. And I think if there's ever going to be any future for the Palestinians, it was only going to be in the form of a two-state solution. But Palestinians are now being convinced that because Zionism is colonialism, if they just keep on hitting back a little bit harder, a little bit more war, a little bit more terrorism, another bombing, another intifada, another set of rockets from Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah or the Houthis or Iran, right? That next strike is going to cause the end of colonialization, right? It's almost like this messianic dream of decolonialism that the left is playing around with, and the left is deluding the Palestinians into believing this. This is the reason, historically, that Palestinians have said no to many of the famous two-state solutions offered, right? Look it up. Don't trust my word for it. This happened in the 1930s. This happened again in 1947. This happened again in 2000. This happened again in 2008. Better yet, pause this podcast for a second. Make sure to come back to it because there's a lot of more important, interesting ideas. But pause this podcast for a second and Google, look up on Wikipedia, use ChatGPT, however you find your information. Read 10 academic articles about the 2000 and 2008 attempted two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. While there's a lot of nitty-gritty nuances in the details, the overall thrust is that Palestinian leadership generally said no, because why should they accept half a state when they think they're going to get the whole thing with just a little bit more terrorism? And this is exactly what happened. The Second Intifada, which happened in the early 2000s, broke out after saying no to the 2000 attempted peace treaty in Camp David. And it makes all the sense in the world. If the international community and activists and academics are saying, of course, just that next bombing is going to cause all Israelis to go back home, right? They think that home is, Poland or something. We'll discuss that in a minute. But if all Israelis just go back home, right, all we need is a little bit more bombing. And so the Second Intifada was a massive wave of suicide bombings, buses blown up, pizza shops blowing up, cafes blowing up. Did the Second Intifada make life better for Palestinians? Of course not. The Second Intifada resulted in the wall or the security banner or whatever you want to call it between Israel and the West Bank, and a proliferation of checkpoints that hurts Palestinians in their day-to-day lives. The lives of the average Palestinian after the Second Intifada was far worse than before the Second Intifada, right? This is only through a lens of caring about Palestinians. Activists in the West are convincing the Palestinians that it's an all or nothing game. And it's an all or nothing game because they're seeing Zionism through a colonialist lens, which is not how anybody in Israel sees itself, right? They think that Zionism is the French in Algeria. Just to review, and again, if you haven't heard of the Algerian War and the decolonizing of Algeria, also pause this podcast and read about it. Again, Wikipedia, academic articles, a podcast, whatever you want to get information about it. This was a situation of decolonialism via bloody war working, right? Whatever we think about the war, the Algerians punched enough at the French, and there was massive casualties on the Algerian side, also on the French side, and eventually it just stopped being worth it for France to have a colony in Algeria, right? It makes a lot of sense from some perspective. If colonialism is seen as somebody coming into my house, and the entire time that person's in my house, I'm punching them in the face, even if they're punching back, eventually it's not worth that person to sit in my kitchen, even if they're eating free food, right? That's the playbook of decolonialism, and it worked in Algeria. And so you think, if Zionism is colonialism, the Palestinians just need a little bit more terrorism, a little bit more uprising, and eventually one day the Zionists will leave, which is of course not the reality. And so what's happening now in the campus protests with the proliferation of calls for intifada and river to the sea, separate than whether or not any of this constitutes anti-Semitism, we could even think, this is not my opinion, but one could even think there is nothing anti-Semitic at all about any of these anti-Israel protests, right? One could think that the river to the sea is not anti-Semitic. One could think calls for global intifada is not anti-Semitism. Heck, one could even think, again, not my opinion, but one could even adopt the premise that saying that Zionism is motivated by white supremacist, racial, right, hatred, right? One could even say that's not anti-Semitic, but it's wrong. And it's wrong, even if you think it's right in a descriptive way, it's wrong in a normative way, meaning this is not the path to future Palestinian statehood, self-autonomy, and freedom. The path of Hamas is the path of another 20 or 30 years of the Palestinian world being embedded with terrorism. Do Palestinians want to live in a society that every hospital, school, and restaurant has a rocket launch site and Hamas bunker built underneath it? Because that is the path that Western activists are forcing or cheering or lauding or pushing the Palestinians down, right? If you just strike back a little bit harder, another intifada, right? It's easy. If you're a privileged school child or college student at Columbia or at UCLA to sit in the comfort of your Ivy League and scream intifada, intifada, look, isn't this great? Anti-colonialism. What intifada actually means for the day-to-day Palestinian is another 20 years of the Israeli army setting up checkpoints right out of their village. It's another 20 years of the Israeli army consistently raiding their houses and villages. Again, I'm not making any normative statements, right? The morality of this is a completely separate question, but that is the political reality on the ground. So even if you disagree with all of my personal views, and personally, I'm a Zionist, I'm pro-Israel, I make no claims to hide that. But even if you reject all those premises, even if you think Israel's bad, you have to have a plan to dealing with Israel and helping the Palestinians beyond vague terms of anti-colonialism that's going to embed Palestinian society in another 20 or 30 years war. Now, this is something, interestingly enough, that many in the Sunni Arab world has figured out. So there's a very uncanny flip that's going on. You'll note you don't see many rallies saying from the river to the sea or cheering on Hamas and Hezbollah happening across the Arab world, right? The Sunni Arab world now is more afraid of terrorism as they are concerned with helping the Palestinians. And when I say terrorism, I mean the global terrorist networks that Iran and the Iranian government has funded all throughout the Middle East. You see this happening in Yemen. You see this happening in Lebanon. You see this happen in Syria. Any country in the Middle East that Iran has embedded itself into has collapsed, right? No country in the Middle East wants to be a Syria. You don't want a country that has a civil war and terrorist militias that are, hiding out in different areas, and there's no centralized government, and there's no trade with the West, and you're under sanctions. No country wants that. And so what's happening now is other Arab countries are noticing this, and they are giving up on the Palestinian cause because they understand, right? They're playing realpolitik while people on campus are playing some anti-colonialist activist thought experiment. And more on this a little bit later in terms of how this is bad for the university and academia. But my first claim is this is bad for the Palestinians. This will not help. And hopefully something changes, but I'm not very optimistic in terms of this changing, in terms of the activism in America right now. In 15 or 20 years, when the state of the Palestinian world is much worse, we're going to point back to times like this as saying they just dug deeper, right? This clearly is not the way that Palestinians are going to achieve any dignity. And again, if you don't like this argument, if you sound like this is flippant, if you disagree with me and it sounds like I am justifying terrible actions of Israel in your mind because I say, well, it's just the way that the world works, right? You have to zoom out. That's far too narrow of a view. It stems from this fundamental dichotomy of the premises that people are engaging with. Is Zionism an act of colonialism that by definition can go away if you punch it enough? Or is Zionism completely disconnected from any thoughts of colonialism, and the 7 million Jews in Israel today view Israel as their homeland, which is of course the reality. There were signs at rallies. I saw Jill Stein, right? For those who don't know Jill Stein, she is a politician, right? She runs the Green Party, right? They don't get a major percentage of votes, but presumably there are hundreds of thousands of Americans that listen to her and vote for her and follow her. She was caught at a rally saying the Jews have a country, they have Poland. 3 million Jews were killed in Poland in the 20th century. Jews are not going back to Poland. Other people, even that insinuate that Jews are from Poland, might not realize that about 60% of Jews in Israel are from the Middle East. Are you really going to tell a Jew whose family is from Syria or from Iraq or from Morocco or from Yemen? I have a lot of good friends growing up and they're Yemenite. Are we going to tell them, right? Do the anti-colonialists on college campuses want Yemenite Jews in Israel to all of a sudden move back to Yemen? Do we have any pretense that when they get to Houthi-controlled Yemen, those Jews will be treated with anything but, at best, a degraded dhimmi status where they live as second-class citizens, but probably beaten and tortured and accused of loyalty and all the terrible things that have happened to Jews in Islamic countries over the past 70 years? This is, of course, a delusion. And you don't even have to care about Jews. And you don't even have to care about Israel. You don't have to like Israel to understand this argument that what activists are doing through these protests is just digging Palestinians down a path that is terrible for their own future. We have to give Palestinians a fighting shot, and I genuinely believe that. The same ideas and universalistic concerns that make me a Zionist, that agree to self-determination for the Jewish people, also make me want a Palestinian state. I believe that all peoples should have the right to self-determination, especially if it's on a homeland that is historic to them. And so there should be a Palestinian state. Of course, a lot of steps need to happen in order to ensure the safety of said Palestinian state living next to Israel. There has to be a game plan to make sure that Hamas can't pop up there or Iranian terrorist proxies can't pop up there. But when I see the future in 20, 30 years, what I hope for is there's a situation where there is a state somewhere in the region called Palestine where Palestinians can live and set up a society however they want and be safe and be free. That's what I want. And that's exactly what academics and activists and people on campus that are giving into this delusion of the Palestinians fail to see, that they are the reason why Palestinians are not going the route of a two-state solution, but are just digging themselves in deeper in terms of fighting back against what they see to be colonialism. And here's where you get to the last final step of why these protests are bad for the Palestinians. There is now a full-scale conflation of the Palestinians with Hamas that a lot of activists are using. From the river to the sea is a Hamas slogan. Again, whether or not you think this is anti-Semitic, put that aside. It used to be that when people saw Palestinians and people were talking about a two-state solution, the idea would be, okay, Palestinians have, just like any group, some amount of radicals that want the whole thing, that view terrorism as a legitimate means of fighting back, but the majority of them just want peace, just want a state, and so we could engage. Activists are pushing Hamas talking points onto the conflict in a way that was not on my bingo card in 2020. And what I mean by that is it is only going to be easier for Israel in the next 20 or 30 years to laugh away the idea of a two-state solution, because they're going to say, who are we going to have two states with? With a jihadist, radical Islamic terrorist group that has sworn they want to kill all Jews in the world, right? Hamas, or Hezbollah, which has a similar charter, or the Houthis, which have a similar charter, or the Iranian government that, every week it seems like they're, tweeting death to Israel, death to America, right? Of course not. And so the Palestinian cause has been conflated with the most radical formulation of the Palestinian cause that, again, even if all you care about is Palestinians, the protests are bad for them. The next obvious group that the campus protests hurt is just this wider idea of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is a very fragile experiment, right? This idea that we live in a society that treats people as individuals, where we have freedom, where I could say one thing about, say, what I think a minimum wage should be, and you say another thing, and even though I think you are extremely wrong that you think minimum wage should be, I don't know, say $40 an hour, and I think minimum wage should be $10 an hour, we're not going to go kill each other over it. We have public conversations. Maybe I'll invite you onto my podcast. We'll debate about minimum wage. By the way, my actual opinion is not $10 an hour. I'm just using this as a thought experiment, but I invite you onto my podcast. We discuss. Other listeners here, hopefully they agree with one or other, right? That happens hundreds of times over, right? On podcasts, in the public sphere, in classrooms, and thought experiments. Eventually that mobilizes a population to vote for a politician who presumably has equally built themselves up through these types of debates. And you have the presidential debates and Congress, and you have a society where people have fierce disagreement, and we don't kill each other because of it, right? For all of human history, people killed each other when they disagreed with ideas, right? This is true religiously. This is true nationally. This is true politically. Heck, this is true even internally, right? If you read anthropological accounts of ancient tribes, and it doesn't even matter where these tribes are, right? People killed each other over everything. One of the great experiments of modernity and liberalism is this idea that we can actually live with difference, right? Not superficial difference of skin color or gender or anything like that. Fundamental difference, what we believe. I can say I believe in God, and you can say I do not believe in God. And in a liberal democracy, I don't have the right to enforce that on you. You don't have the right to enforce that on me. And hopefully we grab coffee and we have an excited conversation debating about God. And then at the end of the day, we both go back to our homes and know that we live in a wider system, that both of our speech is protected, and neither of us are hopefully going to try to kill or harm the other person because we had a disagreement about theology or philosophy or politics. But the idea of liberal democracy only works if we buy into it. Liberal democracy is a normative view of the world. It is not descriptive. There's no more obvious account for that, right? Think about the foundation of America. Now, of course, America did not live up to this idea, but the foundation of America, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, right now, we would say all humans are created equal. Are all humans created equal? Let's talk about this claim from a rationalist perspective. Let's put aside religion. Let's put aside all these other things. Is it rational, right? I had this thought experiment with students in my medieval Jewish philosophy class the other day when talking about Maimonides' opinions about normative versus descriptive, for those who are interested in the nerdy background for this thought experiment. Is it a descriptive claim that all humans are created equal? Well, I would argue that it is not, right? And here's a thought experiment. Imagine you have an alien that's never been to Earth before, never been to America before, and is touring around the country. And you ask that alien, are all humans created equal in America? That alien's going to say no. There are clearly people that are living in better houses than others. There are clearly people that have access to material wealth in a way that other people don't. There are clearly different people that have a whole variety of physical attributes that other people don't have. Certain people are more beautiful than other people, right? These are all inherent privileges. And again, much of it is the way that people were born, right? People don't choose to be born into a rich or poor family. People don't choose whether or not the genetics are going to allow them with natural beauty or not. People don't choose whether or not they're going to grow up in certain neighborhoods or not, right? It's a luck of the draw. And so if you're this alien and you're answering this question, are all humans created equal? in America, your answer descriptively is no. But when we say that in America, all humans are created equal, that's a normative statement. That is, we should set up our society and we should live under the premise, the moral premise that all humans are created equal. So if I go to court with you, we don't care if that alien says, well, of course, all humans are not created equal. One of us grew up in a rich, affluent area, and the other person grew up in a poor area. One of us is ugly, and the other one is very good looking. So of course they're not equal. Why should the court treat them as equal? We say no. We say we are creating a useful fiction, let's call it, that all humans are created equal. And the entire foundation of our country stands on these ideas that are not necessarily true in any rational sense. I can't prove to you in a scientific classroom or in a math class that all humans are created equal. It's not the same truth that the 3 angles of a triangle add up to 180. That is an objective truth. That is a descriptive truth. When I say all humans are created equal, that is a normative truth. And liberal democracy hangs on a set of normative ideas about the way that we all buy into about society. The idea that we allow for freedom of speech, the idea that we allow for freedom of religion. These are not just some interesting ideas we learn about in civics class in high school. These are fundamental ideas that the future of liberalism, capital L liberalism, hinge on. And this is under attack. And this is under attack by a type of postmodernist ideology that has come in like a wrecking ball to completely destroy what's left of this idea of liberalism. Are there even any self-evident truths anymore? Do the claims of postmodernism allow for normative descriptions? Because postmodernism is against grand claims, right? It's skeptical of any grand claims. Any attempt to talk about universality or ethics or normativity is seen as postmodernism as just another tool of oppression. Of course, a postmodernist would tell you if they popped into this podcast, you are talking about all humans being created equal. That's just propaganda that the upper class or white people or politicians keep telling the rest of Americans so that we don't have rampant stealing in the streets, because if people realize the truth in the mind of the postmodernists, that there's no such thing as inequality, even as a future thing to work towards, then of course people are not going to be law-abiding citizens, nor should they be, is the claim that the most extreme postmodernists make. And so any attempt to have civilization, to have society, to have order, to have an attempt to come to a consensus on the most important ideas is not just challenged by postmodernism. The entire endeavor is seen as not kosher by the postmodernists, because they say any attempt to even think about these questions from a universal perspective is immediately inherently tainted and flawed. And so we're now dealing with everybody having their own truths. And so now the university, activists, academia is all about everybody having their own truths. But we can't live in a world where everyone has their own truths. The claim of genocide has been thrown at Israel. Is there such thing as a universal definition of genocide? If there is, we should really have a conversation about it. But if we're living in this world where everybody has their own truth, where there's no such thing as universalities, sure, according to your definition, Israel's committing genocide. According to my definition, Hamas is committing genocide. According to some other person's definition, any heteronormative person in America is committing genocide, right? We'll just throw around the claim of genocide because it means nothing anymore, right? Nothing's going to mean anything if we keep on going down this road. And liberal democracy requires these foundations that we buy into, these foundations that are not above discussion. We should, of course, revisit these and discuss it. But the idea that there are universals that we can come to as a society, this is key. And if there's any way that our human civilization, I'm not even talking about Israel right now, is going to be able to survive once there's even more a proliferation of nuclear weapons, once AI gives humans power that we can never have fathomed, once ideas like COVID are going to be able to be printed by 3D printers in any home office across the world, unleashing dangerous pathogens onto everybody, we need to live in a world in which we agree in some set of norms and universals. And the idea of postmodernism is coming in and wrecking this idea. And we see this both on the far left and the far right in American political life, right? When Trump gets caught lying, unlike other politicians historically, he doesn't give some half-ass apology, or he doesn't try to say, well, technically this wasn't a lie. He says, of course I lie. Everybody lies. Politicians always lie. And all his supporters clap. And Trump is saying, yeah, there is no truth, right? We're all playing in this idea where I have my truth and you have your truth, right? When far left people talk about identity, a lot of times you'll hear, well, my truth, or your truth, or that's their truth, or live your truth, right? Both of these ideas are anathema to what we are trying to create and what we need to create if we're going to survive as a society. And lastly, this goes right into the idea of the university. The idea of the university is one of the greatest institutional experiments probably in human history. You're creating these mini cities full of people in their most formative years, 18 to 23. I love being in a university. I've been on a university campus for 14 years straight as an undergrad and grad school, and now as a rabbi/professor at UC Irvine. I absolutely love the idea that the university stands for, because in theory, the university has all of the best hallmarks of a liberal democracy packaged into a tight-knit community full of people that are supposed to be thinking about the most fundamental issues in the world. But the problem is that university and academia is ceding its way to activism. You know, just a couple of days ago, in my medieval Jewish philosophy class at UC Irvine, we were comparing the dueling conceptions of God between two great Spanish medieval Jewish thinkers, Moses Maimonides and Judah Halevi, both rabbis in Spain in the 11 and 1200s, and Maimonides and Judah Halevi have vastly different conceptions about God and Jewish people and God's role in the universe. And for people who are interested, Maimonides is much more of a naturalist and a universalist, and Judah Halevi is much more of a proto-mystic and a particularist. For people more interested in that, come find me some other time. Maybe I'll do an interesting medieval Jewish philosophy podcast another time. But I had students, after talking for probably 6 class sessions about Maimonides' philosophy and Judah Halevi's philosophy, come to office hours and say, I'm confused. And I say, why, this is a confusing topic, but what specifically are you confused about? And they say, it's hard to know what you think about this. And I said, what do you mean what I think? Your personal opinions. You're obviously somewhat of a religious person, right? They know I'm a rabbi, right? I wear a kippah on campus. Do you agree with Maimonides, or do you agree with Judah Halevi? And I said, yeah, well, when I'm in class, I try to present them both in their strongest light. And the student says, well, that's really interesting, but then how are we supposed to know what you think? And I looked at the student and I said, no, you don't understand. The whole reason why I present them both objectively is because I don't want you to know what I think. I don't want to show up to class on day one and say, we're going to learn about that idiotic, stupid theory of Judah Halevi, and then we're going to learn the real truth of Moses Maimonides, or vice versa. But that is not how a lot of classes are being taught on campus now. A lot of classes, especially in the social sciences and humanities, whereas they pretend to be objective, bottom-up searches for the truth through data and analysis and peer-reviewed studies, have become top-down mechanisms of starting with the premise and then tautologically proving your own premise. If you start off with a certain theory, right, and it doesn't even matter what this theory is, you can pick any example that exists in the social studies. If you start with a theory, say, I'll pick an example just out of left field. If the beginning of your premise is that there is always going to be inherent systemic racism in America, whether or not you agree with that, we might agree with it. I actually agree that there is systemic racism in America, but let's separate that from the argument I'm about to make. If your premise as an academic is there's systemic racism in America, now let's go prove it. That's not called being a good academic. You just start off by saying, I have a question. Is there systemic racism in America? If there is or isn't, what data might I use to try to prove it? And teaching a college classroom should be the same way. If you are taking a class in the social sciences or the humanities, especially for questions on which there is no consensus in scholarly accounts, obviously if there's consensus, that's a different question, right? We don't want to have academics present the Holocaust as neutral. Did it happen? Did it not happen? Or present, slavery as neutral, right? I'm not talking about that. But what I'm talking about for questions that our society is clearly still debating and conflicted on, and in which once you get to the real world or real politics, there is good debate to be had about these questions. Say abortion is another one. there's a really interesting debate to be had about the ethics of abortion. Now, personally, I've done, 4 podcasts about this, so you can go back and visit those, right? My opinions on abortion are not secret. But if I was teaching a class on the ethics of abortion, I would not show up on the first day with a giant sticker on my shirt saying, I support a woman's life to choose. Because then every student there, the students they know this is not going to be a well-reasoned account of abortion. This is going to be Daniel already having views. And if I write on the first day of class saying, well, we all know that abortion is a fundamental right that all women should have, that's not considered good academia, right? That is not how you prepare citizens to engage in a liberal democratic world. Perhaps students can conclude that, and if a student came to me at the end of the class and said, now that we've read 10 weeks, differing accounts, we've read conservative thinkers and liberal thinkers and religious thinkers and secular thinkers, thinkers that see that a fetus does actually have some rights, thinkers that say a fetus doesn't have rights. Now, what do you think? Maybe I would tell them, maybe, hey, it's a complicated issue, but at the end of the day, I support a woman's life to choose. But that's not what's happening in the classroom. Right now, the classroom is acting as if the presuppositions that they are starting the research with is the whole point of their academic endeavor. And the wider higher education system is producing people that are more fit to be activists than well-rounded citizens that are able to act in a liberal democracy. Now, needless to say, this is a very scary time. And of course, I didn't even talk about all the ways in which the campus protests are bad for Jews, right? Perhaps that'll be a future podcast. Perhaps that is intuitive. But I hope you send this around to people that are trying to think critically about these wider issues. I'm sure this will not be the last word that I have about these campus protests. This is going to be a much talked about issue over the next many, many years, both in American Jewish life and also wider campus political life. But I hope this gives you some food for thoughts, and stay tuned for next time.